He thought wealth could protect his family from the world's cruelty, from judgment, from bias, from the quiet kind of racism no one talks about.
I'm okay, thank you.
But one afternoon, when a billionaire heard laughter coming from his disabled son's room, laughter that wasn't supposed to exist, everything he believed shattered. Behind that door was more than a surprise. It was a truth about dignity, neglect, and how society decides who deserves joy and who doesn't. What he discovered forced him to confront a painful reality far bigger than his mansion walls. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from, and if you're new here, subscribe to Stories of Racism, because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. Marcus Whitfield's life had been built on precision. Every morning followed a schedule refined by years of discipline, wealth, and expectation. He woke before dawn, reviewed global markets before breakfast, and left his glass and steel mansion before the city fully stirred. His name carried weight in boardrooms, his decisions shaped companies, and his fortune insulated him from most of the world's unpredictability. From the outside, Marcus appeared untouchable, another powerful man who had mastered the system and bent it to his will. But inside the walls of his home, life moved more slowly. 2 years earlier, everything Marcus thought he understood about control had collapsed in a single violent moment. An accident, sudden, cruel, and unforgiving, had changed his 8-year-old son Oliver's body forever. Since then, the ground floor of the mansion had been rearranged to accommodate a wheelchair. Ramps replaced steps. Therapy equipment quietly took over spaces once meant for toys. Doctors came and went, speaking carefully, professionally, as if softer words might soften reality. Marcus listened, nodded, and signed checks. He did what he knew how to do best: fix problems with resources. Yet nothing truly fixed the silence. Oliver had become quieter after the accident. Not withdrawn in a dramatic way, but careful. His laughter came in measured bursts, his smiles practiced, as if he didn't want to take up too much emotional space. Marcus told himself this was normal. Children adapted. Healing took time. And so Marcus filled that time with schedules: physical therapy in the mornings, educational tutors in the afternoons, specialists flown in from cities whose names sounded like solutions. Joy, Marcus believed, would return once progress did. The house reflected that belief. It was immaculate, efficient, and emotionally distant. Staff moved quietly. Conversations stayed practical. Even Marcus's wife, deeply involved in charity work, seemed to orbit the pain rather than touch it directly. No one meant to ignore Oliver's inner world. They simply didn't know how to enter it. Outside the gates of the mansion, the neighborhood told a different story. A few blocks away, near an abandoned grocery store that had been forgotten by city planners and investors alike, a small group of unhoused families tried to stay invisible. The contrast was impossible to miss: luxury homes with manicured hedges standing just streets away from cracked sidewalks and boarded windows. It was a line the city pretended wasn't there. And like many people with privilege, Marcus rarely crossed it. Sometimes, from the back seat of his car, he noticed a child sitting near the curb with a worn backpack and mismatched shoes. She appeared no older than 10. She never begged, never knocked on doors. She simply existed in that in-between space where people looked past her rather than at her. Marcus registered her presence in the same distant way one notices a flickering streetlight briefly, without engagement. He did not know her name, he did not know her story, and he did not realize how often she passed near his home. Marcus believed racism was something loud and obvious, something he would surely recognize if it ever touched his life. He supported diversity initiatives at work, donated to social causes, and spoke about equality in abstract terms. In his mind, injustice was a problem of systems, not something that lived quietly inside well-kept neighborhoods or behind closed doors. What Marcus didn't see was how race and disability quietly shaped whose pain was noticed and whose was overlooked. He didn't see how Oliver, once vibrant and curious, had begun to disappear behind careful smiles because the world no longer expected much from him. He didn't see how children like the girl near the grocery store learned early that curiosity, imagination, and joy were luxuries society rarely extended to them. On the afternoon, everything began to change. Marcus came home earlier than usual. A board meeting had ended ahead of schedule, and for once, he decided not to fill the unexpected time with calls or emails. The house greeted him with its familiar stillness. No staff, no conversation, just echoing hallways and the faint hum of air conditioning. As Marcus walked toward the ground floor, something felt different. Not wrong, just unfamiliar. A sound carried through the house, light and unrestrained, cutting through the silence he had grown used to. It was laughter. And in that moment, without yet knowing why, Marcus felt a quiet sense of unease. Because that sound did not belong to the life he thought he had built. Marcus stopped mid-step, his polished shoes planted on the marble floor as the sound reached him again. Laughter. Bright, unfiltered, alive. It echoed softly down the corridor, unfamiliar in a house where silence had become routine. For a brief second he wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him, if this was some memory resurfacing from before the accident, before everything had changed. But the sound came again, clearer this time, layered with excitement and movement. It was coming from Oliver's room. Marcus felt a tightening in his chest. Oliver rarely laughed like that anymore. Not since the doctor's voices had grown careful, not since encouragement had turned into pressure, and praise into progress reports. Marcus told himself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe a therapist had arrived early. Maybe his wife had returned unexpectedly. Still, something about the laughter unsettled him, not because it sounded wrong, but because it sounded too free. As he moved closer, Marcus became aware of another detail that didn't fit. Beneath the laughter was motion. Not the mechanical whir of a wheelchair, not the careful shifting he was used to hearing. This sounded like footsteps, quick, confident, moving without hesitation. The sound of a child at play. Marcus slowed his pace. His hand hovered near the doorframe as a familiar conflict rose inside him. Part of him wanted to step in immediately, assert control, restore order. Another part hesitated, held back by a feeling he couldn't quite name, fear perhaps, or the sense that whatever was happening inside that room existed outside the careful world he had constructed. For 2 years, Marcus had convinced himself that protection meant structure, that love meant preparation, that shielding his son from disappointment required constant supervision and intervention. He had not questioned whether that protection had slowly become confinement. He had not asked whether Oliver's world had grown smaller, not because of the wheelchair, but because of lowered expectations. The laughter continued, spilling through the partially open door, refusing to be quiet. Marcus's thoughts drifted, uninvited, to the world beyond his gates, the children who learned early how to survive without safety nets, without schedules, without adults who hovered with concern. He had always believed those lives existed far away from his own. Separate, unconnected. Yet here he was, standing in his own hallway, confronted with a sound that didn't belong to his carefully managed reality. He reached the door at last. His fingers brushed the handle, cool and solid beneath his palm. Whatever waited on the other side, Marcus sensed, would not be something he could solve with money, influence, or control. And as the laughter rose once more, full and fearless, Marcus realized he was standing at the edge of a moment that would quietly, permanently change how he saw his son and the world around him. The door opened just enough for Marcus to see movement, and then he stopped breathing. Inside the room, nothing looked damaged, nothing looked dangerous, yet everything felt wrong in a way he couldn't immediately explain. Oliver's wheelchair was positioned near the open patio doors, sunlight spilling across the floor and reflecting off polished surfaces Marcus had once chosen for durability, not warmth. His son's arms were raised high, his body leaning forward with an intensity Marcus hadn't seen since before the accident. Oliver's face wasn't careful or restrained. It was open, alive. And standing in the middle of the room was a child Marcus did not recognize as belonging there. She was small, thin, her clothes worn in a way that spoke of repetition rather than fashion. Her shoes didn't match. Her posture, however, was unshaken, feet planted wide, shoulders squared, arms moving with practiced confidence. In her hands was something ordinary, almost absurd, yet the way she held it transformed it into something else entirely. She wasn't pretending to be brave, she was being brave. Marcus felt a jolt of alarm. His first instinct wasn't curiosity, it was fear. Who was this child? How had she entered his home? Why was she near his son? His mind raced through assumptions shaped by years of privilege and unexamined bias. Security failure, trespassing, risk, liability. Words that came easily to men like him when something disrupted order. His body tensed, ready to step in, to reclaim control. Then Oliver laughed again. It wasn't polite. It wasn't subdued. It was loud enough to echo, free enough to feel almost dangerous in a house that had trained itself to be quiet. Marcus froze, because in that sound was something unmistakable joy that didn't ask permission. As Marcus watched, the girl moved with purpose, responding to Oliver's excitement as if the wheelchair didn't exist. Not once did she slow down for him, not once did she speak to him like he was fragile. She moved as though she saw him not as limited, but as central, as capable. Marcus had never seen anyone do that before. The moment stretched, uncomfortable and electric. Marcus realized this wasn't their first interaction. The rhythm between them was too natural, too practiced. This wasn't a spontaneous encounter. This was something ongoing. Something that had been happening without him knowing. A deeper unease settled in. Marcus began replaying recent weeks in his mind, the moments he had missed. The afternoons Oliver seemed brighter for reasons no chart could explain. The subtle changes Marcus had dismissed as progress from therapy. What if they weren't results of schedules or specialists at all? What if something else had been entering his son's world, something Marcus had never thought to provide? His attention shifted fully to the girl. He recognized her now, not from conversations or introductions, but from the background of his life, a fleeting presence outside the gates. A child he had seen sitting near the curb, backpack always on, eyes alert. Someone he had noticed without seeing. She didn't belong to his world, and that realization exposed something uncomfortable. Marcus had spent his career claiming he valued equality. He spoke confidently about fairness, opportunity, and access. Yet here he was, startled not by the idea that his son was happy, but by who had brought that happiness into the room. A homeless child. A child from the margins. A child society trained him to overlook. The contrast was impossible to ignore. His son, surrounded by resources, had been quietly shrinking. This girl, surrounded by scarcity, carried herself with strength and imagination that filled the room. And somehow, without permission, she had crossed a boundary Marcus believed was absolute. The injustice began to surface in layers. Marcus realized how differently the world treated children like her. How often their presence was questioned before their intentions. How quickly their creativity was labeled disruption instead of resilience. If a child from his social circle had been standing there, Marcus would have smiled, perhaps even praised the play. But this child's worn clothes and uncertain belonging had triggered suspicion instead of gratitude. That recognition stung. As the game continued, Marcus noticed how the girl adjusted her movements not to accommodate disability, but to amplify Oliver's sense of command. She responded to his choices instantly, exaggerating success, turning small decisions into victories. Oliver leaned forward, engaged, directing the action with focus and confidence Marcus hadn't seen since the accident. For 2 years, Marcus had tried to give Oliver strength by fixing his body. This girl had given him strength by honoring his voice. And Marcus felt the weight of that failure pressed down on him. He stepped back into the hallway, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like armor that no longer fit. The laughter followed him, refusing to fade. It filled the space where silence had ruled, exposing how empty that silence had been. Memories surfaced uninvited, meetings where accessibility had been discussed as a cost, charity galas where photos were taken and forgotten, conversations about inclusion that never reached lived reality. Marcus had believed racism and injustice were problems he could solve with donations and distance. He had never considered how quietly they operated within his own home. Because racism wasn't always shouting. Sometimes it was neglect. Sometimes it was the lowered expectations placed on bodies and backgrounds deemed inconvenient. Sometimes it was deciding who belonged in certain spaces and who did not. Marcus realized that if he acted on instinct, if he confronted the situation with authority and fear, this moment would end the same way so many others did. The girl would disappear, the laughter would stop. Oliver's world would shrink again. And Marcus would tell himself he had done the responsible thing. The thought made his chest tighten. He leaned against the wall, listening as the sounds inside the room rose and fell, vibrant and alive. For the first time since the accident, Marcus understood something he had avoided for years. His son was not broken. He had been confined by caution, by pity, by a system that confused protection with control. And the child society had written off the one with no address. No safety net had been the first to see him clearly. Marcus didn't yet know what he would do. He only knew that whatever happened next would test everything he believed about power, race, worth, and what it truly meant to care for another human being. Because once you see injustice up close, once it laughs inside your own home, you can never unsee it. And Marcus was standing on the edge of a decision that would either restore silence or change everything. Marcus stayed in the hallway longer than he meant to. Long enough for doubt to creep in and wrestle with instinct. Long enough for old habits to demand action, security protocols, boundaries, explanations. He had spent a lifetime responding quickly, decisively, never allowing uncertainty to linger. But this moment resisted control. Every time he shifted his weight toward the door, the laughter inside pulled him back. He listened more closely now. The words being spoken weren't loud, but they carried conviction. The girl wasn't commanding Oliver, she was responding to him. Adjusting to his pace, amplifying his choices, making his decisions matter. She wasn't performing kindness, she was practicing respect. That distinction unsettled Marcus. He realized how rarely Oliver was given that kind of respect. Teachers spoke gently, cautiously. Doctors explained things around him rather than to him. Even Marcus, in his effort to protect, often spoke on Oliver's behalf instead of waiting for his voice. Without meaning to, he had taught his son that his body defined the limits of his authority. Inside the room, that rule no longer applied. Marcus felt a flash of defensiveness rise in him. Who had allowed this? How had this child entered his home repeatedly without anyone noticing? The answer came uncomfortably fast. No one had been looking. The staff had routines. His wife had commitments. Marcus himself had schedules built around absence. Oliver had been supervised, managed, protected, but not truly seen. And that invisibility had created space. The girl moved closer to Oliver's wheelchair now, lowering her voice, turning the game into something quieter, more focused. Marcus could tell the shift was intentional. She was reading Oliver's energy, responding to it. This wasn't reckless play. It was care untrained, unofficial, but deeply attuned. Marcus felt something twist inside him. Outside the gates of his home, the world often viewed children like her as problems waiting to happen. Too loud, too poor, too unpredictable. He had absorbed those narratives without ever questioning them. Now, confronted with evidence that contradicted them, he felt exposed, because the threat he had anticipated wasn't real. The danger he had imagined existed only in assumption. The real risk, Marcus realized, had been his absence. His thoughts drifted to the systems he trusted, schools that separated, neighborhoods divided by invisible lines, policies framed as neutral that quietly favored some lives over others. He had believed racism required intent, hatred, malice. But standing there listening to his son laugh, Marcus began to understand how injustice thrived in quiet spaces in the moments where no one intervened, because no one noticed. The girl had noticed. She had noticed Oliver sitting by the window day after day. She had noticed how adults spoke over him. She had noticed how the world treated him as fragile, limited, incomplete. And instead of accepting that version of him, she had offered another. That offer came with risk. Marcus understood that now. A homeless child entering a billionaire's property wasn't a harmless act in the eyes of the law. It was trespassing. It was punishable. The consequences wouldn't fall on Marcus or Oliver. They would fall on her. The realization made Marcus's stomach tighten. Every instinct trained by power urged him to end the situation quietly, cleanly, to restore order without complication. He could do it kindly, even generously. Offer food, offer help, then close the door. Return things to the way they were. That path was familiar, safe, but it would also erase something fragile and rare. Inside the room, Oliver's voice rose with excitement, issuing instructions with confidence Marcus hadn't heard in years. The girl responded instantly, exaggerating defeat, celebrating Oliver's command. The joy was shared, mutual, alive. It wasn't charity, it wasn't pity, it was equality in motion. Marcus felt his throat tighten. He realized this wasn't just about his son. It was about who society allowed to give and who it expected only to receive. It was about how children from marginalized backgrounds were rarely seen as sources of strength or wisdom, only as problems to be managed or saved. And here she was, saving nothing, fixing nothing, yet restoring something essential. Marcus stepped closer to the door, the decision pressing heavier with every second. He understood now that whatever he did next would ripple outward. If he intervened the wrong way, he would confirm every fear the girl likely carried about spaces like this, about men like him, about what happened when invisible lines were crossed. If he did nothing, he risked admitting how little control he truly had. The laughter inside paused, replaced by focused silence. Marcus sensed the moment shifting. Game's end, reality returns, and when it did, someone would have to decide what this interaction meant. Marcus took a breath deeper than he had in years. He no longer saw a security issue. He saw a mirror one reflecting the quiet ways power excluded, the ways racism hid behind respectability, the ways even love could become a form of harm when guided by fear instead of understanding. Whatever happened next would force Marcus to choose between preserving comfort and confronting truth. And for the first time since the accident, he wasn't sure which choice he was brave enough to make. Marcus's hand finally touched the doorframe, not to open it wider, but to steady himself. The house felt different now, as if the walls were listening, as if the silence that had once protected him was slowly being replaced by something demanding attention. Inside the room, the game shifted again. The girl lowered her stance, speaking with urgency, her movements slower, deliberate, as though the stakes had grown higher. Oliver leaned forward, his entire body engaged, his voice firm as he made decisions. He wasn't being guided. He was leading. Marcus felt an unexpected surge of fear, not of danger, but of loss. Because he knew this moment couldn't last forever. Childhood moments never did. But this one felt especially fragile, suspended between discovery and disruption, between understanding and misunderstanding. He wondered how many times this scene had played out without him. How many afternoons Oliver had waited by the patio doors, watching the light move across the floor, hoping for something to break the routine. How many times the girl had stood outside the gates, weighing the risk of stepping closer against the pull of companionship. These weren't questions of coincidence anymore, they were patterns, quiet ones, easy to ignore if you weren't looking for them. Marcus thought of the word trespassing again, and how often it was applied selectively. How children from certain neighborhoods were treated as threats simply for existing in the wrong space. How fear was often justified after the fact, wrapped in language about safety and responsibility. He had used those words himself before, believing them neutral. Now they felt heavy with implication. Inside the room, Oliver's laughter softened into focused concentration. The girl paused, watching him carefully, waiting for his signal. That patience struck Marcus deeply. In a world that constantly rushed past Oliver past his pace, his needs, his voice, this child had learned to wait, to listen, to respond. Marcus realized how rarely he had done the same. The injustice revealed itself not as a single act, but as an accumulation. 1,000 small decisions that taught people like Oliver to accept less, and people like the girl to expect rejection. A system that didn't need cruelty to function, only neglect. Only assumptions left unchallenged. Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. An email, a reminder, the outside world demanding his attention again. For once, he didn't check it, he didn't move. He stayed rooted in that hallway, caught between who he had been and who this moment was asking him to become. Inside, the game reached a natural pause. The girl lowered her makeshift weapon, breathing steady, eyes bright. Oliver's shoulders relaxed, but his expression stayed alert, hopeful, as if he didn't want the moment to end. Marcus felt the tension spike. This was it. The point where reality would intrude, where rules would reassert themselves.
He understood now that his next action would either reinforce every barrier he had unknowingly upheld, or begin to dismantle them, starting right here, in his own home. Marcus had spent years believing leadership meant command, that strength meant control, that protection meant restriction. But watching his son and this child together, he saw a different truth emerging. Leadership could mean listening, strength could mean vulnerability, protection could mean trust. The rising action of this moment wasn't loud. There were no raised voices, no confrontations, just a quiet reckoning unfolding inside a man who was finally seeing the cost of his blindness. Marcus inhaled slowly, preparing to step forward, not as a billionaire, not as a man with answers, but as a father willing to face the uncomfortable truth. Because once you recognize how injustice slips into ordinary spaces, you can no longer pretend it belongs somewhere else. And Marcus knew, with a clarity that left him unsettled, that whatever he chose to do next would define far more than this afternoon. It would define the kind of world his son would grow up believing in, and the kind of man Marcus would be when the laughter finally faded. Marcus remained where he was, suspended in a moment that refused to resolve itself. Time seemed to stretch, bending around the quiet gravity of what he was witnessing. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't intrusion. It was connection, raw, unfiltered, and profoundly inconvenient to the story he had told himself about safety and order. He began to understand how easily injustice survived in spaces like his own home, not through cruelty, but through comfort, through the belief that good intentions were enough, through the assumption that providing resources excused emotional distance. Marcus had given Oliver everything except the one thing no amount of money could replace: agency. Inside the room, the girl shifted closer to the window, letting the sunlight fall across both of them. It illuminated the contrast Marcus could no longer ignore. Oliver, wrapped in privilege yet constrained by expectation. The girl, carrying nothing but imagination, yet moving freely through the world with a resilience forged by necessity. Society had decided early which of them needed protection and which of them needed restraint. Standing there, Marcus saw how wrong that decision had been. He thought of the meetings where accessibility was discussed as an expense rather than a right, of neighborhoods quietly shaped by zoning laws and unspoken rules, of how children learned early which spaces welcomed them and which spaces required permission they would never be granted. He had lived comfortably within those systems, rarely questioning who they excluded. The laughter inside the room returned briefly, softer now, as if conserving itself. Marcus felt the urgency building again. He knew moments like this didn't announce their importance. They passed quietly, and later people wondered when everything changed. This was one of those moments. Fear rose in him, not fear of the girl, but fear of failing this test, fear of defaulting to instinct, fear of choosing ease over growth. He understood that confronting racism didn't always look like standing against something loud and obvious. Sometimes it looked like standing with something fragile and easily dismissed. Marcus realized that if he interrupted this moment poorly, he wouldn't just end a game. He would confirm a lifetime of lessons the girl had already learned about who was allowed to belong. He would teach Oliver once again that joy was conditional. The weight of that responsibility settled heavily on his chest. For the first time in years, Marcus didn't reach for certainty. He allowed himself to sit in discomfort, to acknowledge how much he didn't know. He let the rising action play out not as a problem to be solved, but as a truth to be faced. Because somewhere between the echo of laughter and the quiet of his hallway, Marcus Whitfield was being confronted with a reality no boardroom had ever prepared him for. And the closer he came to the door, the clearer it became. This story was no longer about what he had built. It was about what he was finally willing to unlearn. Marcus stepped fully into the doorway. The sound inside the room didn't stop immediately. That was the first shock. The laughter didn't freeze. The movement didn't halt. For a brief second, the world inside Oliver's room continued as if Marcus Whitfield, billionaire, father, authority, did not exist. Then the girl noticed him. The shift was instant and devastating. Her body stiffened, not in guilt, not in confusion, but in recognition. A recognition born of experience, of pattern, of knowing exactly what adults like Marcus represented when they appeared unannounced in spaces she was never meant to occupy. The banana slipped slightly in her grip. Her shoulders tightened. Her eyes flicked, not toward Marcus's face, but toward exits, door, patio, distance. Oliver noticed too. The joy on his face faltered, replaced by something Marcus had seen too often since the accident: fear of loss. Not fear of punishment. Fear that something good was about to be taken away. The air thickened. Marcus felt it then, fully and painfully. This wasn't just a private moment between children. This was a collision between worlds that were never meant to overlap. A collision charged with race, class, power, and unspoken rules about who was allowed to feel safe where. The girl took a step back. Not running, not yet, just creating space. The kind of space children like her learned to create instinctively the moment authority entered the frame. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came, because suddenly he was aware of how loud his presence was, how heavy. He saw himself through her eyes. A man in a tailored suit, a house too big, a space too clean, a life that had always belonged, and she standing barefoot on emotional ground that could collapse at any second. Oliver turned his wheelchair slightly, instinctively placing himself between them. The movement was small, but it landed like a blow. His son, his fragile, protected, carefully managed son, was shielding someone else. "Dad," Oliver said, his voice tight. That single word carried everything. "Please don't stop this. Please don't make her leave. Please don't turn this into another thing I lose." Marcus's chest burned. He realized then that the climax of this story was not loud. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic confrontation. The injustice lived in the silence, in the girl's readiness to disappear, in Oliver's fear of joy being revoked, in Marcus's power to end this moment with a single word. And he almost did. The instinct rose sharp and fast. This isn't appropriate. This isn't safe. This isn't allowed. Years of conditioning lined up behind those thoughts, the systems he trusted, the rules that kept his world intact, the unspoken belief that some boundaries existed for good reason. But then Marcus saw the girl's hands trembling. Not from guilt, from expectation. She was waiting for the moment she had lived through before. The moment when adults decided her presence was a problem, when kindness turned conditional, when imagination was mistaken for intrusion, when survival meant leaving quietly, without protest, without explanation. He saw how practiced she was at it. And something inside Marcus finally broke. Not softly, not neatly, it shattered. He saw, with horrifying clarity, how racism didn't need slurs or violence to wound, how it operated through access, through comfort, through who got the benefit of the doubt and who never did, how children like Oliver were pitied into smallness, while children like her were feared into invisibility. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a reckoning. Marcus felt his heart pound, his pulse loud in his ears. Every second stretched. Every movement mattered. This was the moment that would define the story, not just for him, but for both children standing in front of him. The girl finally spoke, her voice quiet, controlled, already preparing to retreat. "I can go." 3 words. They hit Marcus harder than any accusation ever could. Because she wasn't asking. She wasn't defending herself. She was complying. Oliver's hands clenched into fists. And Marcus realized, with a clarity that terrified him, that if he let her walk out that door, he would be complicit in the very injustice he had spent his life pretending existed somewhere else. This was the line. And once crossed, there would be no pretending ever again. Marcus didn't answer her right away. That silence, measured, deliberate, stretched longer than the girl expected. Too long. She had learned that when adults hesitated, it usually meant they were deciding how firmly to say no, how quickly to end things. Her grip tightened around the banana, not as a weapon now, but as something familiar to hold onto, while the ground shifted beneath her. Oliver felt it too. His breath grew shallow. His eyes moved between his father and the girl, searching for cues, bracing for impact. This was the moment he knew well, the moment adults reclaimed control, the moment fun was explained away or postponed or removed entirely in the name of responsibility. He had lived through countless versions of it since the accident. Doctors ending sessions, therapists checking watches, adults deciding they had seen enough. But this felt different. Because this time, the loss wouldn't just be his. Marcus finally moved, but not toward the girl. He took a slow step into the room, stopping well short of her space. His hands remained visible, empty, open at his sides, a gesture he hadn't planned, one that surprised him as much as anyone else. He noticed the girl watching his hands closely. That detail cut deep. She wasn't afraid of his voice yet. She was afraid of what those hands represented: authority, removal, the power to decide where she could stand and when she had to leave. Marcus had shaken hands worth millions with those hands, signed documents that changed lives he would never meet. Now he saw them as she did, tools that could erase her presence with a single motion. Marcus swallowed. The room felt smaller now, heavier with everything unsaid. He became acutely aware of how many eyes would never witness this moment, how no cameras were recording, no crowd gathering, no headlines waiting. This injustice, this choice, would happen quietly like most of them did. And that made it more dangerous. Oliver broke the silence. She didn't do anything wrong. His voice was steady, but the effort behind it was visible. Marcus felt the weight of that sentence land squarely on him. Not a plea, a statement. Oliver wasn't asking permission. He was asserting truth. Marcus met his son's eyes. For the first time in years, Oliver wasn't shrinking under his gaze. He wasn't waiting to be corrected or redirected. He was holding his ground, whatever that meant from a wheelchair. Marcus felt the sting of realization. This was what leadership looked like when you were denied physical power. It lived in conviction, in voice, in presence. Marcus turned back to the girl. She still hadn't moved, still poised on the edge of disappearance. "I know," Marcus said finally. The words sounded strange in his mouth, too simple, too heavy. The girl blinked once, twice. He saw the confusion flicker across her face. Adults rarely agreed so quickly, rarely validated without condition. Suspicion crept in immediately, replacing fear, because kindness without cost was something she had learned not to trust. Marcus felt exposed. He realized now that the injustice wasn't just what he might do, it was what the world had already taught her to expect. That her presence required justification, that she owed explanations before she was allowed to stay, that safety was temporary and always borrowed. Marcus inhaled slowly, grounding himself. "You don't have to go," he said. The words landed, but they didn't settle. The girl didn't relax, she didn't smile, she didn't move closer. She stayed exactly where she was because experience had taught her that reversals were often temporary. Adults changed their minds, rules shifted, safety evaporated. Oliver exhaled sharply, relief and disbelief colliding. His shoulders loosened, just slightly. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd been holding himself together until that moment. Marcus saw it all. And suddenly the room wasn't just a room anymore. It was a crossroads. One path led back to the familiar world, controlled, predictable, unequal. The other led somewhere uncertain, uncomfortable, and honest. Marcus chose to keep going. "I should have knocked," he said quietly. "That's on me." The girl's eyes widened. Not because of the apology, but because of who it came from. Adults like Marcus didn't apologize to children like her. Not sincerely, not without a lesson attached. This was a disruption of the natural order as she understood it. Oliver turned toward his father, stunned. Marcus continued, his voice steady but stripped of authority. "I didn't realize how often you'd been here." The girl hesitated. "After school," she said, "I leave before it gets dark." There it was. The proof of pattern, of routine, of risk taken again and again because something inside this house had called to her more strongly than fear. Marcus felt a tightness in his chest. She had been navigating this boundary alone. No safety net. No assurance that one wrong moment wouldn't cost her everything. And before that, Marcus asked gently. She looked down. The answer didn't need words. Marcus understood then that this wasn't just about letting her stay. It was about everything that followed, about whether his acknowledgement would translate into protection, or whether it would end at sympathy. He felt the old instinct rise again, the urge to delegate, to fix, to hand this off to professionals and programs, but something stopped him, because this wasn't a problem to outsource. This was personal. Oliver spoke again, his voice stronger now. "She makes me feel normal." The sentence hit Marcus like a blow. Not healed. Not improved. Normal. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. How many times had Oliver felt abnormal without ever saying it? How many times had Marcus reinforced that feeling by focusing on what needed correction instead of what needed acceptance? The injustice sharpened, crystallized. This wasn't just racism at work. It was the intersection of race, disability, and power, layers of marginalization compounding silently. Oliver pitied into invisibility. The girl suspected into exclusion. Both denied full humanity in different ways. And Marcus had been standing in the middle, benefiting from systems that failed them both. He opened his eyes. Something in his expression must have shifted because the girl's shoulders lowered a fraction. Not trust, but possibility. Marcus took another step forward, stopping beside Oliver's wheelchair. Not in front of it, beside it. A deliberate choice. "I'm glad you found each other," he said. The words hung in the air, fragile and monumental. Oliver's eyes filled with something dangerously close to tears. The girl finally loosened her grip on the banana. But even as the tension eased, Marcus knew this wasn't the end of the climax. This was only the midpoint of it, because acknowledgement carried consequences, because choosing to see injustice meant choosing to act. And that action would ripple outward into his marriage, his reputation, his carefully curated life. It would invite scrutiny, discomfort, resistance. The hardest part was still coming, because welcoming someone in was one thing. Changing the world that pushed them out was another. Marcus looked at the open patio doors, the sunlight spilling in, the invisible line between inside and outside. And he understood that the true test wasn't whether he could protect this moment, but whether he could protect what came next. The relief in the room was real, but it was fragile. Marcus felt it the way one feels ice thinning beneath their feet. The tension hadn't vanished, it had only shifted shape. Outside the walls of the mansion, the world still existed exactly as it had before. Systems didn't dissolve because one man chose differently in a quiet room. And Marcus knew, with a sinking certainty, that the moment he stepped fully into this truth, it would not stay contained. The first intrusion came softly. A distant voice. A gate opening. Footsteps where there were not supposed to be footsteps. Marcus's head turned instinctively toward the hallway. The girl noticed immediately. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up, muscles tightening, spine straightening, eyes darting again toward escape. Oliver saw it too, and panic flared across his face, sharp and sudden. "What is it?" Oliver asked. Marcus didn't answer right away. He was listening. The sound grew clearer. Adult voices now, confident, assumptive, the kind of voices that moved through spaces expecting compliance. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The bubble around them, the fragile safety of the room, was thinning. This was the moment he hadn't wanted to imagine. The moment where private conviction collided with public consequence. Marcus knew those voices. Security. Someone had noticed. Someone had decided this situation needed handling. Protocols engaging without context. Rules stepping in where understanding had not yet caught up. The girl took a step back, then another. "I really should go," she said, her voice calm but stripped of hope. This time it wasn't compliance, it was self-preservation. Marcus felt something snap inside him. "No," he said quickly but gently, "stay." The word landed differently now, because this time, staying meant confrontation. Oliver's breathing grew uneven. He had lived through enough losses to recognize the signs. This wasn't a quiet ending. This was the moment where things broke loudly. Marcus moved fast. He stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him, not locking it, not hiding, but signaling something unmistakable. Deliberate ownership, responsibility. He crouched slightly to Oliver's level, placing a steady hand on the arm of the wheelchair. Not protective, present. "I need you to trust me," Marcus said. Oliver searched his face. "Are they going to make her leave?" Oliver asked. The question was small, but it carried the weight of every time Oliver had been told what would happen without being asked how it felt. Marcus met his son's eyes and made a promise he could not take back. "No." The certainty in his voice startled even him. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A knock followed, firm, professional. Marcus straightened slowly. Every instinct screamed at him to revert, to smooth things over, to minimize, to turn this into a misunderstanding that ended neatly. But this was no longer about neat endings. This was about who was allowed to exist without explanation. Marcus opened the door. The hallway felt colder now, harsher. Two members of security stood there, posture alert, faces neutral. Behind them, the open front door framed the outside world, cars passing, normal life continuing, oblivious to the reckoning unfolding inside. "There's a situation," one of them said. "We were alerted." "I know," Marcus interrupted calmly. The word carried authority, but it was different now. It wasn't command, it was accountability. "There's a child inside my son's room," the guard continued carefully. "She doesn't appear to belong." Marcus felt the injustice flare hot and immediate. "She belongs," Marcus said. The silence that followed was heavy. The guards exchanged a glance. This wasn't how these situations went. Not here, not with someone like Marcus Whitfield. "I invited her," Marcus continued, his voice steady, loud enough for Oliver and the girl to hear. "She is my guest." That was the moment. The irreversible one. Because with those words, Marcus publicly aligned himself with a child the system had already labeled a problem. He placed his credibility, his authority, his reputation on the line, not for optics, not for charity, but for truth. The guards hesitated. Protocol clashed with power. Assumption collided with instruction. Slowly, reluctantly, they stepped back. Marcus closed the door again, not slamming it, not dramatic, final. Inside the room, the girl stared at him. Not with gratitude, with disbelief. Oliver let out a shaky breath he had been holding far too long. Marcus turned back to them, his chest tight, his heart racing. He knew the consequences were already in motion. Questions would come, conversations, pushback, his wife, his staff, his peers, the quiet judgment of people who would call this irresponsible, dangerous, naive. Let them. Because in this moment, Marcus finally understood something that terrified him more than loss of control. Silence had always been his shield, and he was done hiding behind it. The girl's hands were still trembling, but she hadn't moved, not toward the door, not away. For the first time, she stayed. And as Marcus stood there, between a world that demanded order and two children who demanded dignity, he knew the truth with devastating clarity. This wasn't the end of the conflict. It was the moment everything else would be forced to change. The house did not return to silence after that day. It changed in subtler ways first, not with dramatic announcements or sudden transformations, but with shifts so quiet they almost went unnoticed. The kind of changes that only become obvious when you realize something heavy is no longer pressing on your chest. Marcus noticed it the following morning. He woke earlier than usual, not because of alarms or obligations, but because his mind refused to settle back into the old patterns. For years, mornings had been about momentum, what needed to be handled, fixed, solved. That urgency was gone now, replaced by something unfamiliar and unsettling: reflection. The events of the previous day replayed in fragments. The way the girl's body had tensed when he appeared. The certainty in Oliver's voice when he defended her. The moment Marcus realized that power, when unexamined, could wound without ever intending to. He sat at the edge of the bed longer than usual, staring at his hands. They looked the same, but he understood them differently now. Downstairs, the house felt warmer, not physically but emotionally, the kind of warmth that comes from presence instead of polish. When Marcus entered the kitchen, Oliver was already there, seated near the window, sunlight catching the edges of his wheelchair. He wasn't alone. The girl sat across from him. They weren't playing this time. They were talking quietly, their heads bent together in a way that suggested comfort, not urgency. There was no performance, no need to prove anything, just two children existing in the same space without fear. Marcus paused in the doorway. This, he realized, was what resolution looked like in its earliest form, not perfection but permission. Permission for joy to exist without justification. Permission for presence without suspicion. The girl noticed him and stiffened slightly. The habit hadn't disappeared overnight. Trust, Marcus understood, was not restored by a single moment of courage. It was rebuilt slowly, through consistency. "Good morning," Marcus said, keeping his voice gentle. She nodded, no smile, no retreat. "Progress?" Oliver looked up, his expression calm in a way Marcus hadn't seen in years. Not excited, not guarded, just steady, as if something inside him had finally stopped bracing for loss. That steadiness haunted Marcus in the best way. Later that day, conversations began. Not easy ones. Marcus's wife listened quietly as he explained what had happened. He did not frame it as charity. He did not soften it into a feel-good story. He told it honestly, as a failure of attention, as a blind spot shaped by privilege, as a moment that forced him to confront how racism and exclusion thrived even in spaces that considered themselves good. There were pauses, questions, discomfort. But there was no denial. And that Marcus knew mattered. The staff noticed changes too, not through announcements but through behavior. Doors knocked on instead of opened. Schedules loosened. Laughter no longer treated as disruption. Small things, human things. Outside the walls of the mansion, nothing looked different. The streets were the same. The abandoned store still stood. The invisible lines dividing neighborhoods remained intact. The world did not heal itself because one man chose differently. And Marcus understood something critical. Resolution was not the end of injustice. It was the beginning of responsibility. He began asking questions he had never asked before, not in boardrooms but in quiet moments. Who decides who belongs in certain spaces? Who gets grace when rules are bent? And who gets punished? How often did fear masquerade as safety? And most importantly, how often had he benefited from those answers without ever noticing the cost? Oliver noticed the change in his father before anyone else. Marcus listened more now, not to respond, not to correct, but to understand. He waited. He asked Oliver what he wanted instead of assuming. Therapy still happened, but it no longer defined the day. Play was no longer conditional. For the first time since the accident, Oliver wasn't being prepared for a future where he had to prove his worth. He was being allowed to live in the present. And the girl, still cautious, still guarded, began to stay longer. Not because she was told she could, but because she no longer felt she had to leave. Marcus knew better than to call this a happy ending. Happy endings were easy. They wrapped pain in bows and told audiences everything would be fine if people just tried harder. This wasn't that kind of story. This was about reckoning. Because Marcus now carried something he could not put down, the knowledge that racism was not just something done by bad people, but something sustained by good people who never stopped to look closely at how power shaped their world. And once you see that truth, you don't get to walk away from it. The change did not announce itself loudly. It moved outward in quiet, deliberate waves, touching corners of Marcus's life he had once considered separate. Work, reputation, community, the comfortable illusion that private morality could exist without public responsibility began to erode piece by piece. Marcus returned to his office days later, but he did not return unchanged. In meetings, he heard familiar language differently. Words like risk, liability, exposure. Once, they had sounded neutral, professional tools meant to safeguard investments and reputations. Now, they echoed with the memory of a child bracing herself to disappear. He recognized how easily those same words were used to justify exclusion, especially when the people affected lacked power, wealth, or a voice in the room. For the first time, Marcus interrupted. Not with outrage, with questions. Who is affected by this policy? Who gets removed when we choose convenience over inclusion? Who pays the price when we prioritize comfort? The room often went quiet. Some colleagues shifted uncomfortably. Others pushed back politely, insisting these were complex issues beyond the scope of business. Marcus listened, but he did not retreat. He had spent years mastering systems built on optimization and efficiency. Now he saw how those same systems, left unchecked, optimized away humanity. He began using his influence differently. Not as performance, not as rescue, but as leverage. Inside his community, conversations grew harder. Neighbors asked questions, curious at first, then cautious. Why was a homeless child spending time in his home? Was it safe? Was it appropriate? The concern rarely sounded cruel. That was what made it dangerous. Fear dressed up as reason, bias disguised as responsibility. Marcus resisted the urge to defend himself with status. Instead, he told the truth. He spoke about how easily assumptions formed, about how safety was often defined by proximity to privilege, about how children learned early where they were allowed to exist without explanation. Some people listened, others grew distant. Invitations slowed, conversations ended early. Marcus accepted the cost. Because once you understand how injustice operates quietly, you recognize that comfort is often its greatest ally. The girl's presence changed too, not because she became someone else, but because the world around her shifted, even slightly. She no longer carried her belongings everywhere she went. She laughed more freely, though still with caution. Trust, Marcus learned, was not a switch. It was a muscle built through repetition. Oliver watched it all closely. He noticed how adults spoke to the girl now, more carefully, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes overcorrecting. He noticed how his father pushed back gently when people assumed she needed saving instead of respect. Through it all, Oliver learned something his father never had at his age. That dignity was not granted by power, it was inherent. Marcus saw his son change too, not in ways doctors could measure, but in posture, in confidence, in the way he spoke about himself. Oliver stopped describing his life in terms of what he couldn't do. He began talking about what he did do, what he liked, what he wanted. Marcus realized, with a mixture of pride and shame, how close his son had come to believing the world's narrow definition of worth, and how easily that belief could have followed him into adulthood. The broader impact became impossible to ignore. Marcus began supporting organizations differently, not as a benefactor standing above, but as a listener standing beside. He asked who led these spaces, who made decisions, who lived the realities he had only read about. He learned how often solutions were imposed instead of shaped by those most affected. The girl's story was not unique. That truth was the hardest to sit with. For every child who found a moment of safety in his home, there were countless others who never would. Children whose creativity was mistaken for threat, whose presence triggered suspicion instead of curiosity, whose lives were defined by systems that never considered them when designing fairness. Marcus understood now why racism endured. It wasn't because people refused to care. It was because caring stopped at the edge of inconvenience. And real justice demanded more than empathy. It demanded action that disrupted routines, challenged comfort, and redistributed power. Marcus did not become a savior. That narrative tempted him at times, but he resisted it. Savior stories were seductive and shallow. They centered the comfort of the powerful and reduced others to symbols. Instead, Marcus committed to something slower and harder: accountability. He listened when he was corrected. He stayed when conversations became uncomfortable. He learned to distinguish between intent and impact. He began measuring success not by how good his actions made him feel, but by whether they actually changed outcomes for others. The world outside his home did not transform overnight. But Marcus did. And transformation, he learned, was contagious, not because it spread easily, but because it challenged others to look inward. Some turned away, others leaned in. Both responses revealed truth. As weeks passed, Marcus understood that the incident had ended, but the responsibility had not. This wasn't a chapter that closed. It was a line that had been crossed. And once crossed, there was no returning to ignorance. The story did not end the day the girl stayed. It continued in the days Marcus chose to show up when it would have been easier to step back. In the weeks, he resisted the temptation to turn a private reckoning into a public performance. In the quiet decisions that never made headlines but altered the shape of lives nonetheless. What lingered most was not guilt, but clarity. Marcus understood now that racism was not always an act, it was often a habit of distance, a habit of assumption, a habit of deciding who belonged without ever asking who was being left out. It lived in policies written without faces attached, in neighborhoods drawn by invisible borders, in homes like his where silence had once felt like safety. He had believed the world changed through big gestures. He learned instead that it changed through sustained ones. Oliver grew into himself. Not cured, not fixed, not transformed into an inspiration for others to admire from a distance, but affirmed. He began to see his life not as a story of loss but as one of presence. He laughed without checking who was watching. He argued when he disagreed. He dreamed without qualifying those dreams with excuses. The wheelchair remained part of his life, but it no longer defined the size of it. The girl did not become a symbol. She remained a child, complex, resilient, cautious, joyful. She carried her history without being consumed by it. She learned slowly that some doors could open without slamming shut behind her, that some adults could mean what they said, that safety, while never guaranteed, could be built. Marcus learned to follow their lead. He stopped mistaking control for care. He stopped confusing charity with justice. He stopped assuming his good intentions protected him from causing harm. The more he listened, the more he realized how much he had never been taught to hear. Outside the walls of his home, the world remained imperfect. Children were still judged by their skin before their character. Disabled bodies were still underestimated. Poverty was still treated as a personal failure rather than a systemic one. None of that vanished because one man chose differently. But something essential had shifted. Marcus no longer asked whether racism was real. He asked where it was hiding. He no longer wondered whether change was possible. He wondered who was willing to pay the cost of it. Because justice, he learned, does not arrive wrapped in comfort. It arrives with discomfort, with resistance, with moments that demand you choose between preserving your image and preserving someone else's dignity. And those moments come to all of us. Not in grand confrontations, but in quiet rooms, in decisions no one applauds, in the split second where you can look away or step forward. Marcus stepped forward. Not perfectly, not heroically, but consistently. And that made all the difference. This story is not rare. It is happening in schools, in neighborhoods, in workplaces, and in homes, right now. It is happening every time a child learns they must shrink to be safe. Every time someone is welcomed only conditionally. Every time silence is chosen over solidarity. The question is not whether racism still exists. The question is this: when it shows up quietly in your life, in your space, your comfort, your routine, will you recognize it? And when you do, will you be brave enough to choose differently? If this story stayed with you, don't let it end here. Share it, talk about it, challenge what feels normal. Subscribe to Stories of Racism for daily stories that refuse silence, and ask yourself today and every day, who is waiting for you to notice them, and what will you do when you finally do?